The history of the Korean War is often divided up into four phases. In the first phase, in June of 1950, the North Korean People's Army crossed across the 38th parallel and drove back the South Korean Army and hastily deployed United Nations troops almost to the south end of the Korean peninsula. In the second phase, the United Nations counterattacked and drove the North Koreans almost to the Yalu River. In the shocking third phase, China decided to intervene, and the People's Volunteer Army sent hundreds of thousands of troops into the country, driving back the UN forces below the 38th parallel and retaking once again the South Korean capital of Seoul. But less than a month later, the United Nations was preparing another counterattack, especially the 8th Army under General Matthew Ridgway, and the fourth and final phase of the war was about to begin. The U.S. Army Center of Military History explained the UN position in January 1951. All the territorial gains in North Korea of the earlier phases of the war had been lost, but General Ridgway was convinced the enemy lacked the logistical system to maintain offensive operations for any extended period, and he was preparing to begin a counteroffensive. A 1991 study project of the U.S. Army War College, authored by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas M. Cruz, explains. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway had recently assumed command of 8th Army and was eager to kick off a counteroffensive. Intelligence reported that over 150,000 Chinese Communist troops were in front of 8th Army, but their intentions were something that 8th Army had not been able to determine. Ridgway had come into a difficult situation. The previous December, 8th Army had been on the verge of victory, only for the massive Chinese intervention to throw them back. In December, the shattered army was trying to prevent the South Korean capital of Seoul from again falling to the enemy. General Walton Walker had commanded the 8th through the difficult retreat. Despite the embarrassing withdrawal, Walker had deftly taken advantage of mobility to preserve the army intact. He told reporters, "My army isn't whipped. I'm proud of the way it came out of the offensive, and we will fight again." A medal citation for his service read, "Where acts of personal courage were common, General Walker's fearlessness and courageous leadership were outstanding." On December 23, 1950, reporter Rong Jeon-tae wrote in a 2025 edition of the Korean Chunlang Daily, "Christmas was approaching, even at the front. A father was on his way to see his son. Walton Harris Walker, the then commander of the U.S. 8th Army, was traveling by vehicle to congratulate his son, Captain Sam S. Walker, who was serving as a rifle company commander on the Korean Peninsula and had been awarded a Silver Star. Driving through Seoul, his Jeep collided with a South Korean ammunition carrier. The Jeep rolled over and General Walker, 61 years old, was killed." Ridgway, who had been serving under the Army Chief of Staff, was given command following that tragedy and in a difficult time. John Walker explains in a 2013 edition of Warfare History Online, as Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway boarded a flight to Tokyo, Japan on December 23, 1950, on his way to a meeting with General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, he was not fully aware of the depth of the crisis still unfolding on the frozen Korean peninsula, where American-led United Nations forces and their South Korean allies, who were seemingly on the verge of complete victory in North Korea, were now suddenly on the brink of collapse and perhaps outright defeat. Ridgway's 8th Army included nearly 100,000 troops, including 3 U.S. and 2 South Korean infantry divisions, as well as British, Turkish, and Colombian troops. In addition, Ridgway would have the support of the considerable resources of the U.S. 5th Air Force. Lieutenant Colonel Cruz writes, "The Korean conflict gave the United States Air Force, and specifically the 5th Air Force, the first combat experience since it became a separate service." But Ridgway had to first deal with questions that might still haunt people today, but which were of immediate concern for his command. Billy Mossman served as the historian to the 8th Army and wrote in his 1990 work for the U.S. Army Center for Military History, "The United States Army in the Korean War, Ebb and Flow, November 1950 to July 1951. In his constant attempt to reshape the mood of the 8th Army, Ridgway, during the first days of January, instituted a morale survey in which his troops repeatedly raised 2 questions. Why are we here? And what are we fighting for? These were not questions unique to the 8th Army, but also the world. In this, the first great proxy war of the Cold War, initial public enthusiasm had waned. Polling company Gallup explained in a 2013 blog post, "When Americans were first asked, in August 1950, if deciding to defend South Korea was a mistake, only 20% thought that it was, while 65% said that it was not a mistake. But by the following January, opinion had shifted dramatically, and 49% thought the decision was a mistake, while 38% said that it was not, and 13% had no opinion. Certainly, the human cost of the war had been greater than people initially imagined, but the concept of limited war had left the public and military confused, and the Chinese entry in December gave no clear path to victory. Ridgway's troops were also facing some of the most brutal fighting conditions in the history of the United States military. In Korea, the fighting may have been hot, but its role in the Cold War was quite literal, as Ridgway prepared his troops for the counterattack. The winter of 1950-1951 in Korea was brutally cold, with temperatures plummeting to minus 54 degrees Fahrenheit and wind chills sometimes exceeding minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Sub-zero Arctic winds from Siberia caused widespread frostbite, frozen equipment, and made survival nearly as difficult as facing the enemy. Robert Randall Ryder writes in the Magazine of the American Legion, "The rifles' lubrication oil froze, rendering them useless. Batteries in jeeps, trucks, and radios wouldn't work properly and quickly ran down. Medical supplies, including blood plasma, froze too. Morphine syrettes used for painful wounds had to be defrosted in medics' mouths before they could be injected. Frostbite caused more casualties among U.S. troops than enemy fire." Mossman writes that Ridgway understood that the questions of why are we here and what are we fighting for clearly reflected the lack of motivation in his Eighth Army to move on the offensive. And both, Mossman writes, in Ridgway's judgment, required and deserved well-reasoned replies. His response enunciated the heart of the Truman Doctrine and the way the West viewed the Cold War. To me, the issues are clear. It's not a question of this or that Korean town or village. Real estate here is incidental. It's not restricted to the issue of freedom for our South Korean allies, though that freedom is a symbol of the wider issues and included among them. The real issues are whether the power of Western civilization shall defy and defeat communism, whether the rule of men who shoot their prisoners, enslave their citizens, and deride the dignity of men shall displace the rule of those to whom the individual and his individual rights are sacred, whether we are to survive with God's hand to guide and lead us, or to perish in the dead existence of a godless world. If these be true, and to me they are beyond any possibility of challenge, then this has long since ceased to be a fight for the freedom of our Korean allies alone and for their national survival. It has become, and it continues to be, a fight for our own freedom, for our own survival in an honorable, independent national existence. The sacrifices we have made and those we shall yet support are not offered vicariously for the others, but in our own direct defense. In the final analysis, the issue now joined right here in Korea is whether communism or individual freedom shall prevail. Was this sentiment enough to prepare the Eighth Army for the coming months? Ridgway did have some advantages. The United Nations was better able to deploy forces than it had been earlier in the war. Ridgway had resources that previous commanders had not. Lieutenant Colonel Cruz writes, "The buildup of the forces and equipment by the United States and Allies continued at a rapid pace during the first 6 months of the war. In late January 1951, for the first time, Eighth Army was able to bring to bear the firepower of two major weapon systems, armor and artillery." Ridgway would be taking the attack to the enemy. He described the goals of the planned offensive. "We are not interested in real estate. We are interested only in inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy with minimum losses to ourselves. To do this, we must wage a war of maneuver, slashing at the enemy when he withdraws and fighting delaying actions when he attacks." The Center of Military History opines the fourth phase of the war would largely shape the outcome of the conflict, and the mettle of the men of the Eighth would be tested from the outset. Operation Thunderbolt, which began January 25th, was intended only as a preliminary, a reconnaissance to determine enemy strength and disposition. By January 30th, it became a general advance by Eighth Army. As an offensive, it is perhaps a little-known part of the forgotten war, but for a campaign that was not supposed to be about real estate, it was fought hill by Bloody Hill. Carl Henry Dodd was born in Harlan County, Kentucky in 1925. According to the Harlan Daily Enterprise, he originally enlisted in the Army in 1943. By 1946, he was a sergeant, but had injured his foot while training troops. Discharged in March of that year, in September, despite his injury, he re-enlisted. At the outset of the war in Korea, he was a master sergeant in the 5th Infantry Regiment of the 24th Infantry Division. The 24th was among the first American units to be sent to the fight. The 5th arrived on July 25, 1950, in time for the valiant defense of the Pusan perimeter. On August 7th, Dodd was serving with Company E of the 5th 2nd Battalion in the vicinity of Tindongni, Korea, when his company was overrun. Realizing that his platoon commander was missing, Dodd took charge and reorganized the 12 remaining men and reoccupied the position and held out until the enemy struck from all sides. Forced to withdraw, he personally, and with utter disregard for his own safety, exposed himself to heavy machine gun and small arms fire to help his men retire. His award citation for the Silver Star, the third highest combat award in the U.S. military, notes he was responsible for the safe evacuation of all known casualties from the platoon position. He checked the area to determine whether or not any had been overlooked before he withdrew and was the last man to leave the position. The gallantry displayed by Sergeant Dodd reflects great credit on himself and the military service. Along with the Silver Star, Sergeant Dodd was given a battlefield promotion to the rank of second lieutenant. The Daily Enterprise writes that he was promoted to first lieutenant just a few days before January 30th, when his platoon was assigned to take a piece of real estate called Hill 246, which the Army described as a key terrain feature defended by a well-armed, crafty foe who had withstood several previous assaults. There, Dodd distinguished himself by conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action against enemy. Given the responsibility of spearheading an attack to capture the hill, a citation reads, First Lieutenant Dodd led his platoon forward over hazardous terrain under hostile small arms, mortar, and artillery fire from well-camouflaged enemy emplacements, which reached such intensity that his men faltered. With utter disregard for his safety, First Lieutenant Dodd moved among his men, reorganized and encouraged them, and then single-handedly charged the first hostile machine gun nest, killing or wounding all of its occupants. He led his platoon on to Hill 256, where, firing his rifle and throwing grenades, he advanced at the head of his platoon, despite the intense, concentrated hostile fire which was brought to bear on the narrow avenue of approach. When his platoon was still 200 yards from the objective, he moved ahead and with his last grenade destroyed an enemy mortar, killing the crew. Forced to stop because of darkness, in the morning, First Lieutenant Dodd, again boldly advancing ahead of his unit, led the platoon through a dense fog against the remaining hostile positions. With bayonet and grenades, he continued to set pace without regard for danger to his life, until he and his troops had eliminated the last of the defenders and had secured the final objective. Certainly, General Ridgeway could not question the motivation of men like Carl Dodd. Robert Milton McGovern was born in 1928, a native of Washington, D.C. He enlisted in the Army after graduating high school in 1946. He attended Officers Candidate School, and according to the website Home of Heroes, before his 20th birthday, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and by 1949 he found himself stationed at Camp Crawford in Japan. He was assigned to Company A of the 5th Cavalry Regiment. His regiment landed in July alongside Dodd's 24th Infantry. Like Dodd, he fought to defend the Pusan perimeter and participated in the offensive that took the UN force nearly to the Yalu River, only to be thrown back. On January 28th, McGovern's company was sent to attack Hill 312, where hostile troops were emplaced in bunker-type pillbox with connecting trenches. William T. Bowers quotes Army historian First Lieutenant William Blumenson in his 2008 book The Line, Combat in Korea. Hill 312 was a key point in the enemy defenses. It dominated the surrounding terrain. The hill was strongly defended by entrenchments and emplacements, and the two most accessible avenues of approach were covered by machine guns and automatic weapons, well dug in and excellently camouflaged. An Army citation writes of McGovern leading his company against the hill on January 30th. As First Lieutenant McGovern led his platoon up a slope to engage hostile troops emplaced in bunker-type pillbox and connecting trenches, the unit came under heavy machine gun and rifle fire from the crest of the hill, approximately 75 yards distant. Despite a wound sustained in this initial burst of withering fire, First Lieutenant McGovern assured the men of his ability to continue on and urged them forward. Corporal George Hickson was quoted by Bowers. I asked him if he was all right, and he said, sure, all it did was hit my compass. I knew that he was hit because later on I saw him put his hand in his jacket, and there was blood on it. Machine guns were not the only risk. The citation explains he fearlessly led the platoon to within several yards of its objective when the ruthless foe threw and rolled a vicious barrage of hand grenades on the group and halted the advance. Enemy fire increased in volume and intensity, and First Lieutenant McGovern, realizing that casualties were rapidly increasing and the morale of his men was badly shaken, hurled back several of the grenades before they exploded. Realizing that his men were pinned down, Lieutenant McGovern disregarded his painful wound and weakened condition, charged a machine gun emplacement, which was raking his position with flanking fire, When he was within 10 yards of the position, a burst of fire ripped the carbine from his hands, but undaunted, he continued his one-man assault and, firing his pistol and throwing grenades, killed 7 hostile soldiers. Inspired by his bravery, his men took the position. That victory was a turning point, Bowers writes. The success at Hill 312 and elsewhere led General Ridgeway on January 30th to turn the reconnaissance in force into a full-scale advance. Operation Thunderbolt was followed in February by Operation Killer, which was followed by Operation Ripper, and by mid-July, Ridgway's offensive had allowed the United Nations to stabilize the front around the 30th parallel, pretty much where the whole war began. The offensive included, even though it wasn't one of the original goals of an offensive that was not supposed to be about real estate, retaking the South Korean capital of Seoul, which changed hands for the 4th and final time in the war, led to the stalemate that would result in the ceasefire that is still in effect today. It was the bravery of young officers like Robert McGovern and Carl Dodd, fighting in some of the worst conditions ever faced by the United States military, that had turned back the Chinese. But the end of a war that can only be said to have resulted in a tie became perhaps indicative of the futility of the Cold War. How many young men have fought and died for no clear reason over a long-forgotten hill that didn't even have a name, just a number on a map? Both Dodd and McGovern were awarded the Medal of Honor, but for Robert McGovern it would be awarded posthumously. Private First Class Louis Amos recalled that McGovern had fallen mortally wounded about a foot away from the machine gun that he had disabled. He said, "Had it not been for Lieutenant McGovern's guts and go-get-them attitude, I'm sure that most of the men in the platoon would have been killed." Carl Dodd served in the U.S. Army for 21 years, retired in 1965 at the rank of major. His son, Carl Dodd Jr., told the Weekly Enterprise, "The only thing he would tell me about the Medal of Honor was that he had a lot of help." He passed away on October 13, 1996, at the age of 71. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.